Hello and welcome to another episode of On the Payroll, my podcast where I talk about all the things that interest me, such as leadership, project management, consulting, delivering quality projects with great people. And this podcast, this particular episode is really fun because I get to indulge my data nerd side. I speak to David Masri. He runs Gluon and he's done a whole load of data migration, data transformation projects, and he's even written a book. So I was very cheeky and I got him to divulge a lot of secrets, well, actually, the points within his book on how organizations should think about data migration and why it's so crucial. It is the one work stream I believe that makes or breaks a project, because why would you have a CRM system? You want information and business insight that can help you make strategic decisions. Now, if the information is not correct, not accurate, not timely, not complete, then what's the point of the system? So that's why I think I could have gone on a lot longer on this particular episode, to be honest, but there's a lot of value in there, especially for anyone looking to embark on a project, because data migration is a really key part. I hope you will enjoy this as much as I did making it. Hello, David. Welcome to my podcast on the payroll. It is a pleasure to have you today. So how are you feeling right now?
I'm good, and thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
I've been, excited to talk to you for a while for a few reasons. I'm not going to get into it now, but there are a few things about the journey that you've taken to where you're today that I would like to kind of dig into, mainly because I'm a data nerd, number one. Number two, there's a few things that cross over that I wanted to ask. So to start this off, it would be lovely if you can just tell us the story of how you got to where you are today and the journey that you've taken, and feel free to share any stories that you want to tell.
Yeah, so I've been in tech my whole life, and I'm not a spring chicken anymore. So it's a bit of a long story. I'll try to keep it not too short, not too long. So I've always enjoyed technology. I actually took a coding class the first time I used a computer. Actually, was in sixth grade. I think it was an IBM PS2, and you had to get booted up with a cartridge. You were coding in GBasic at the time. So I kind of enjoyed it right off the bat, and I continued fiddling, with computers. Eventually got a computer at home. My dad bought one. Through high school, and into college. In high school, we're now talking. I started high school in 1990, so I went in high school 1994. So in high school, I was gearing up, thinking I wanted to go into business and finance, and then I went to business school post high school. And I enjoyed computers, so I was minoring in information systems and actually majoring in finance. Because that's what I felt the world was going, and in the late 90s, just all of that changed. And I didn't particularly enjoy the finance side of things, particularly the heavy math aspect. Not that computer systems has much less math, but still. So I switched my major and my minor. So I went from majoring in finance, minoring in information systems, to majoring in information systems, and then minoring in finance. And then, yeah, I was working part-time. I wanted to, get some exposure, get some job experience. I was working part-time through college, various jobs, very low paying, but it did, computer work, either setting up QuickBooks or networks or website access databases, this kind of stuff. So I really enjoyed it. I took a database class in college, by far my favorite information class. I keep in mind at the time, computer languages were much less mature than they are now, right? Hacking away, Java was version 1.1. and I could not stand that thing at the time. So I really like databases. I actually still have my college textbook, I think, somewhere. It's the one college textbook I didn't throw out. It's upstairs. I gave it to my son to read. It's not here. Yeah. So yeah, and so I decided at that point I wanted to go into data work. I wanted to be DBA at the time. So anyway, I finished school. Started working for a media company, doing lots of number crunching, mostly campaign ads, crunching those numbers to performance tune them. We started doing some internet work, banner ads, links, text links, that kind of stuff, crunching those numbers. I then went on to work for Prudential Financial for a couple of years as a DBA. By the time I was at Prudential Financial, we had the whole .com blow up, so the space changed quite a bit. And then 9/11 happened, and things got quite a bit worse in the economy space, putting aside again the politics side of that and the tragedy, of course. So I found myself struggling to find a job. It wasn't easy. I was still fairly junior at the time. I ended up joining my uncle, who was writing custom ERP systems. He had a small professional services shop. So I ended up joining him, and I stayed with him for quite a few years, 5 or 6 years, doing custom ERP systems with him. Learned a tremendous amount from him. That was my first introduction to professional services. And the consulting side of things really tuned my, communication skills, my understanding of business. ERP is a great place to really learn business, because you get the accounting side, you get the operation side. And back in the day, the thought process was everything in ERP, right? So I really learned a tremendous about professional services, about client relations, and about computer systems. And they're also obviously heavy data systems. Ton of integrations there. So we integrated with everything you can imagine. Websites started popping up all over the place. eBay was becoming big, or was big already. Yahoo stores were the thing. I think they're gone now, but we're heavily integrating with things like that. Amazon came around. We started integrating with Amazon for some of our more retail-oriented clients. Lots of EDI work, which is still around, EDI for wholesalers. Integrations with warehouses, with all of the various shipping companies, right? Just a ton of it kind of integration work. I ended up leaving my uncle for various reasons. We still get along great. Have a great relationship with him, with the kids. Nothing personal there. Just the direction and technology he was using was aging. It was a custom. Keep in mind, it was a custom ERP, which is not an easy space, right? You're not talking about implementing, SAP or something, which perhaps we could have pivoted, but that's a whole other story. I then spent a few years in the CRM space, pre-Salesforce. So I was doing sales logics, lots of migrations off Act. That was all C# coding for the most part. At the time, Sales Logics was land-based, then that moved to web-based, and then eventually to AWS, to the cloud. So again, lots of great learning experiences over there. And then I did that for about 5-6 years. Then I went to Weight Watchers, and I did their dynamic CRM implementation and call center, and a bunch of special projects. Then 2 years of Weight Watchers, and then after that, I entered the Salesforce space. I joined a company called Red Kite, and then they were a fairly small boutique CRM company. Salesforce shop did heavily financial services space, and then after a series of acquisitions and a couple of other small moves. So I was at Red Kite for a few years. Red Kite got acquired by Liquid Hub. Liquid Hub got acquired by Capgemini. I did like 6 months at Silverline. Great people over there. Loved working with them as well. And then I went to a company called GSD, which eventually became Plative. They're doing real well. I joined Creative as a director level, and then in in the last year and a half or so ago, I went off and kind of decided to start my own firm, doing specifically data work for Salesforce SIs. So to take a little bit of a step back, when I joined Red Kite, I joined as a project manager. I had no Salesforce skills. All of my tech skills were heavily on the Microsoft stack. And even honestly, when I joined Weight Watcher, there was as a project manager too. But somehow when you have strong technology skills, you always get sucked back into coding. So that has happened to me throughout my career. Honestly, even when I left my uncle, he was coding heavily in FoxPro. That was one of the reasons I had to leave, because FoxPro was no longer supported by Microsoft, and we had to essentially either rewrite the whole platform and start from scratch, which wasn't something I wanted to do. So I ended up joining Weight Watcher, the project manager. Then you get sucked back into the tech side of things. Then I went to Red Kite again, joined as the project manager, got back sucked into the tech side of things. And at some point, I just decided to kind of embrace it. So I had really, really strong data skills, like we said early on. I was always interested in it. Bit of BI work, heavy integrations, and that's really, really, really where I was able to help in a lot of these Salesforce partners, where they had really great Salesforce skills, but not necessarily great data skills. And what happened was I was working on a really, really, really big migration for a firm that will not allow you to mention their name. That's a whole other thing, but that's just how they are, this particular firm. And that was not the greatest of data migrations. I was also building all the integrations for this company too. It was a really big project, and I was there full time, so I had to do a role. I was heading the data track as well as doing the project management work, right? So the integration work was going fairly well, but the data migration was just an absolute nightmare. One of the reasons for it was a homegrown CRM system that was just an absolute mess, and they had no one in the company who knew the system or the back end, and it was to the point that no one wanted to touch it, right? But we still had to get all the data out of it. So, and as you can imagine, the contracts were written that they own getting the data out of it, and they own the data structures, and they couldn't deliver on that. So we ended up having to take that over. And then there was this whole crazy manual data loader process that I just couldn't absolutely believe that this was the normal way to do these kind of migrations. It just seemed so foreign to me. And then I would do research online, like, oh, that's how everybody does it, right? That's how, like, if you Google how do I do a data migration in Salesforce, it's data loader, CSVs, VLOOKUPs, a very heavily manual process. So towards the end of that, I started using a lot of the real strong integration tools that we're using to leverage and fix up the data migration and kind of smooth that out. And then when we got past that project and I had now some time to free up, I basically took over and reworked entirely top to bottom how we did our data migrations at Red Kite. And then when I went to various other firms, I took those processes with me. Eventually, I ended up running a couple of data department divisions within these firms, really training people and putting these best practices in use. And in 2019, I published a book, Developing Data Migrations and Integrations with Salesforce, which is done really well. I'm very happy with it. Got a ton of 5-star reviews. I think like 40 of them, almost, averaging 4.5 stars. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I got where I am now. So then September of 2020, I started Gluon Digital, which again is rather than go off and start, another data department at another firm that was struggling with data, I figured, let me build a company that can focus just on working data integrations and data migrations. And then we partner with SIs to kind of take this off their plate, let them focus on the Salesforce work, and we'll focus on the data work. And it's been going really, 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 really well. So yeah, So the only thing that I'm absolutely set on with Gluon is we do not compete with our clients. So we do not do end client work. All of our clients are either Salesforce SIs or ISVs, and they own the Salesforce work. We own the data work for them. Yeah, that's a mouthful. 20 years in 5 minutes.
Thank you. No, that was quite comprehensive.
Yeah.
We come from a similar space, so Microsoft as well over here, and I was also a DBA for a bit, and I did a lot of infrastructure stuff, so network servers, Exchange servers, those sort of things before moving into CRM. So one of the things that really struck me was your Weight Watchers stint in 2007. So I don't know where Weight Watchers began, whether it was the UK or in America, but in 2007 I ran a discovery for them, so I was aware about how manual and paper heavy the processes were, especially around for, I don't know what they call it, the different locations who are running the meetings and things like that. So that was really, really interesting to me that you kind of picked it up and implemented it in 6
Dynamics
years later.
No, when did I start? Weight Watchers? Not 6 years. I
20...
think I started Weight Watchers in 2012.
Yes, so no, 6 years after I did the discovery.
I see.
For them, so I don't know what happened.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure where you're saying they were on paper. So a lot happened at Weight Watchers. It's really, really interesting story. It still is. Should one day go back and get caught up with some of the people there, but most of the people I worked with have also left. I think there's 1 or 2 people still there. So the Weight Watchers, what they call them, the stores, right? They still have those locations. So they had that was their core of their business for a long time. I think it was actually started in the 30s by someone here in the US, and then they expanded internationally. So the stores were heavily paper. We actually got them off they rolled out a tablet app, and they also rolled out Weight Watchers online to compete, because they were absolutely getting killed in the market by mobile apps, right? Just the whole market was changing. Nobody likes to do anything in person nowadays. It's funny. So they went through a whole kind of digital transformation. They started with Weight Watchers online, then they had to put out the mobile app, and then they had another project to digitize the stores. And then the only work I've done with that was we started to use the CRM to track messages between the Weight Watchers representative in the stores and their constituents, the people who are going to the meetings. So that was but otherwise that wasn't really part of the CRM system.
So it sounds like maybe the different locations was quite divorced in how they managed the IT system, because I'm pretty sure I was at the UK headquarters, and what would happen was that, I can't remember if they called it stores then, but each of these locations would mark down the weights of the members, I guess, on sheets of paper, and those were shipped in to the call centers, who would have to key them in. And the project that I was there to do the discovery on was to turn all of those into using Microsoft Dynamics. So that was where I came from at that time, and have those available and to replace the paper ones. So, but then I finished the discovery, and they picked up that piece of work and contracted people to do the implementation. So it's interesting to see.
It's a completely different CRM system. It's not the same one. I think the store system was called Champ, at least here in the US. And then we integrated with Champ. So we were heavily marketing and call center. And then we would use some of that data for things like, hey, you haven't been to a meeting, we would come back. That would be like a store message. Then there would be like, if someone was flatlining in their progress, right? That they become a risk to leave, right? Or if they haven't gone to a visit. So we would bring that data in a very summarized way in for to be used on email marketing for retention.
Okay.
Yeah.
Really interesting to see how, different places evolve their own set of requirements for what. At that time, like I said, 2006, mobile things, mobile app was not, I don't think I had a mobile phone at that time. Just wasn't a thing. So the first priority was to reduce the overhead on the paper management. So
yeah, they were disrupted 3 or 4 times. And then they found new markets also. So what they found was by going digital also with WeightWatchers.com and the mobile app, they were able to have much more success in the men's market. They were much more likely to want to use an app as opposed to go to a meeting.
mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's really interesting stuff. And then they had to struggle to differentiate between theirs, which is the paid platform, and something like Fitbit, which is free, right? So it's an interesting thing.
How business change and people's habits
so
change.
fast too.
Yes. Okay. So back to your I like data. So I'm just going to your book. Can you tell me when the idea to write it came to you, and how long did it take, and how did you manage that alongside your day-to-day work?
So I was sorry, it's in the post door. I was actually working at Silverline. Silverline had what they call OKRs, objective, and key results, and they push you to put some personal goals on there too. I've always wanted to write a book, so it was like a long time. I wouldn't say I'd call it a dream, but it's just something I kind of wanted to do, more like a bucket list type thing. So I put it down as an OKR with my manager at the time. His name was Eric Nelson. Really, really supportive of it. I already had training programs in place, right? Because I've been doing this from a training perspective. Because again, I built a team at Red Kite prior to this, and then when I joined Silverline, I was doing a couple of training courses on how to do a proper data migration, at least how I defined a proper data migration. I don't want to knock anybody or say they weren't doing things properly. And then we moved on to integration patterns, and so I had all this course material, and it was clear that I already had the context for a book at that time once I kind of put it together. So what I did was I put together a proposal. I sent it over to A-Press. They had it on their site. And yeah, I mean, they jumped on it. The reason I went to A-Press was I basically went on Amazon and say, oh, hey, who's selling Amazon books? Who's selling Salesforce books? And it was basically A-Press and Packet are the only two companies. Packet is, let's say they're a little bit more of a self-publishing type style, although I don't know if they would classify themselves like that. A-Press, as many people know, is a known technology brand, a company I highly respected for a long time. So for me, it was a no-brainer. I figured I'd try them first. And yeah, they got back to me almost immediately. They were very interested. It took me about 10 months to write it. In the proposal, I had the whole outline, right? All the chapters, and I didn't even deviate from that too much. So yeah, I mean, it was 10 months on Sundays, a little bit during the week if I had a slow week at work. And yeah, that's basically it. Just now you put in the work. Again, I had all the content for the most part. It's just getting it down on paper.
Talk to me about your emotional journey during that time. How did you feel from like beginning to end?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I didn't get frustrated writing it at all. I knew exactly what I wanted, and I had a full vision for this whole book. I had one of the things when I wrote this book that I wanted to make sure that I'm not doing, and it was almost a guiding principle, is I'm not taking stuff that's readily available online and just rehashing it. You know, it's all brand new content. It's not stuff you're going to find anywhere else. It's a patterns and practices book, right? That's a subtitle. So again, developing data migrations and integrations with Salesforce, patterns and best practices. So there is some code in there, but not a tremendous amount. And it's tool agnostic, so it's not like it's pushing you towards a particular tool. I do discuss tools, obviously, because that's important, but again, it's not guiding you towards a particular tool. And again, it's all patterns and best practices, right? This is how you design your code. This is how it should flow. These are the core attributes you need to be aiming for, and then how to structure it. I'm really happy with how it came out. Probably should have spent a little bit more time on the grammar checking and the editing and all of that. You're never happy with you always manage to find a typo somewhere after, and but otherwise, yeah. I mean, I wrote that book in order. It's not like I went back and modified chapters. The only time that I did do that was, I think I was up to chapter 4 or 5, when I wanted to change the style of the book from lecturing, where I'm talking about me and you, to more of a we, like, let's do this, or we need to do this, right? Just to be a little bit more inclusive and more friendly sounding nature. That was the only time I had to go back and but even then it was very systematically go back and change the style of writing. People, at least one person, my tech editor, Jared, his name is, real great guy. He thought that I used like I dictated it and had a computer just record what I was saying when I wrote it, because it's a very conversational style book. I wanted to keep it relatively light in terms of, or easy, fun reading. Yeah.
Okay. So in terms, do you want to share just something, if you were to summarize that book to someone who, wants to buy it? So for example, I've not bought that book. I was going to cheekily ask you for an autographed copy and how I might get it. But to say someone who's thinking about moving into Salesforce, and I were to tell them, you ought to get Dave's book. It's got, can you just summarize that?
I'll take you through how it's structured. It starts off, believe it or not, chapter 1 is relational databases. So I cover the foundational stuff that if you're coming from the Salesforce side of things, you may not know, right? What's an index? What's a basic join? The philosophy behind a relational database, why it was designed, all of that kind of stuff, right? So that's chapter 1, is just understanding relational databases for people who don't come from a database background, right? Chapter 2 is for people who either know Salesforce or don't know Salesforce, and it says Salesforce tells you it's a relational database, but it's really not. And this is how Salesforce is structured. The differences between Salesforce and a relational database. And then we go into how Salesforce is kind of architectured, and then why. Like, why did Salesforce make these decisions to move away from standard relational rules when they did, right? So that's chapter 2. And the reason that's like an important chapter is because most people, they come from Salesforce, they think of it as a relational database, and it's really not. It's close, but it's not. And it's great to compare it to a relational database because that's the closest thing to it. And the other thing is, when you're building code with Salesforce and you want to understand, why am I getting locking errors? Why is it designed this way? To understand the architecture and the theory behind the architecture is very, very instrumental in that. And that's why very important too, right? And that's why I included that chapter. Chapter 3, overview of the Salesforce APIs, right? And how to use them, and then some basic introductions to creating fields, and we do a little bit of data loading with the like did an exercise to do some basic data loading with the data loader, just to get you understanding there. We also cover other ETL tools and for the cons of those. Chapter 4, I start getting into best practices. And then chapter 5, best practices, the core attributes. I think chapter 4 is the core attributes. I'm going to open the book because my memory is not as good as I think it is. Let's see, where is it? Where's the copy? Where's the copy? There we go. See? Okay, so chapter 4 goes into the 6 attributes of a good data migration. These you'll probably see my content on my blog, salesforcedatablog.com. I have a ton of writing to supplement the book. So even though after the book finished, I wanted to continue to expand on a lot of topics that are somewhat out of scope for the book, but we touched on it in the book and then really wanted to build on it. So chapter 5 is the attributes of a good integration, right? And then chapter 6 is best practices. So I go through about 40 best practices and I relate each of the best practices to the attributes that I outlined. The 6 attributes essentially is well-planned, automated, controlled, reversible, repairable, and testable. For a good data migration, integration, the difference is repairable is not enough. It has to be self-repairable, meaning because it's going to continually run, it needs to fix itself if something goes wrong, not rely on a human interaction. So chapter 6, again, best practices, I tie them back to the attributes. Chapter 7 is putting it all together. So we do a sample migration, start to finish. Chapter 8, error handling and performance tuning. Really interesting chapter. I have a great blog article on performance tuning that was expanded from this chapter or summarized down from this chapter. It's something that people really don't understand, the inner workings of the Salesforce data engine. So we kind of cover that in this chapter. Chapter 9, we're now moving towards integration to synchronization patterns. How do I synchronize data between 2 systems? I think we go through like 6 or 7 patterns of how to do that, and we talk about the pros and cons of each of them, right? And again, there's no code in this chapter. There's like visual flows and whatnot, but the point is to understand how to think about data synchronization and what are the challenges and how do you avoid conflicts and all of that kind of stuff. Chapter 10 is other integration patterns. So this is things like how to deal with record merging, how do I deal with ETL-based rollups, how do I archive data out, right? So these are not data synchronizations, other. Chapter 11, real-time integrations, as well as UI integration. So not just data, maybe I want to integrate between various UIs, user interfaces. That's the core of the book for the most part. Everything else is essentially extras. So chapter 12 is I have a whole library of reusable code, which I share. So these are SQL functions for the most part that do common transformations. For example, I need to parse out the domain of an email address and put that into the web fields, right? So I need to, convert camel case because my raw data is all uppercase. Like lots of these kind of code snippets that can be reused in a SQL environment. Chapter 13 is FAQs that just go through a bunch of commonly asked questions. And then I have 3 appendixes. Appendix A talks about data cleansing and deduplication. Again, not necessarily the core of the book, but in a really, really important topic. And it goes through an algorithm for detecting duplicates. Appendix B is references. So just like reference cards if you wanted to pin them up or print them out and that kind of stuff, just like a quick reference guide. And then Appendix C is just references and further reading. So just every single footnote in the book is summarized there, and every single data source, that I've used. So if I said this is how the Salesforce engine worked, I pointed to the Salesforce doc that came from. So yeah, I think this is on my blog too. I ended up pulling out the appendix and making it a blog post as well. That's essentially the book. So, like I said, it's very structured, and it's not stuff that you'll find generally in other places.
That is incredibly comprehensive. I
Yeah.
wish I had something like that when I was doing, my data migrations, and I didn't do very much integration because that leaned a lot on coding and things like that. So in the Microsoft side, I just stayed with SQL databases and things like that. So that was pretty comprehensive. So in terms of I'm just trying to think. In the UK, we've got this big thing around data privacy, and when we were part of the EU, there's GDPR, and therefore data migrations used to be a big pain. So, what is it like in America in terms of handling personally identifiable data? How do you handle it as part of the projects that you do?
So this is an interesting question. It's funny because I do a lot of data security work, for my clients, and previously when I was at various companies, just because you happen to have the expertise. So over here in the US, and I'm not a lawyer, so I apologize if I get any of this wrong. It's generally only health data that's really, really super private, right? And then you also have other data that's really strict because it's a real security issue, right? You're dealing with financial firms, and maybe there are regulations on, big trades that might happen, that kind of stuff. But the PII is not necessarily a huge issue. You might have bank account information, which again can be a big disaster if it's compromised. So essentially, my philosophy is, and I keep in mind I'm coming from the professional services side of things, is I have a set of security requirements, a bare minimum that I'm going to meet. Our clients have a set of requirements, and we're going to take the higher of the two, right? So, and if the client has super strict requirements, it's going to be no problem. You stand up the infrastructure, you give us access, we work on your hardware, right? Our goal here is not to become a data platform where we're storing data for people and really taking ownership of it. That being said, we do have some of our own infrastructure, which again, I'd secure myself. It tends to be for clients that have not as strong needs or wants in terms of their security, or ours is just stronger than theirs because they're, relatively small shop. And then very important, make sure you're doing your diligence when it comes to data destruction, right? Don't leave stuff out there when you don't need it. That's probably the number one thing you can do is, right? Don't keep data that you don't need and it's not mine.
Fair enough. Thank you for that. Yes. So, in your very long history, you will have done quite a number of projects. I'm keen to hear about your favorite one. Do you have a favorite project with a client that you think that was a really good project?
So keep in mind that my clients now at Gluon are Salesforce SI. So they're not my clients, they're their clients, the projects that I'm working on. So I'm not necessarily comfortable talking about the specifics. I will say from an integration side, generally my favorite projects tend to involve really big data warehouses that need to be stood up with an analytics component and then some kind of integration with Salesforce. And yeah, they tend to be, very enjoyable and really bring a tremendous amount of value to our clients. So those are one that I think those are the categories that I find the most interesting and the most challenging. In terms of data migrations, in a lot of ways, the data migrations are harder than integrations in a lot of ways, and people don't realize that. The biggest reason is it's not uncommon to get a data migration that I need to migrate 25 objects, 30 objects, That is incredibly uncommon for an integration. An integration is 1 or 2 objects, maybe 4 or 5, and that's pushing it. Right? And then at the end of the day, it's still got to be wholly automated, and it's still got to work, and I got to do my error logging, right? And it's got to run in a short period of time. So, data migrations, again, they're a lot of times a lot more complex. They do get a little bit more on the tedious side of things, particularly on the mapping and the data cleansing and all of that stuff. So yeah, I think I definitely enjoy the data integration work a bit more, particularly for, I guess I would say somewhat a little bit less technically sophisticated. Not nothing, but like you want someone, a company that's, somewhere in the middle. They understand technology, they know how to use it, they know they can take advantage of it, but they're not there yet. And then you can really, really get them, to be a company that's really, data driven. Yeah.
So what was there a specific point in time, or was there a trigger that made you think that you might prefer, starting up Gluon at that time? What made you make that jump?
It was a combination. It was a combination of things. Essentially, I was already thinking of moving on from my current employment for whatever reason, and then I had a couple of former colleagues of mine, different companies, basically saying, "Hey, come work for us. Come work for us." And I ended up just basically taking them both on. So I had a clear path, right? So rather than go working for one of them, I just decided I'll just work for both of them and do my own thing. And then I always had this idea of, maybe I should try to build a data migration division that can help SIs. And this was the ideal time to do that because I now had the freedom to, without competing with anyone. But that's kind of how it happened. Call it a victim of circumstance. You know how it is. Opportunity knocks. Not like it's something that I was planning for years and years and years. I probably spent my whole life saying I don't want to work for myself because of the amount of work, and not necessarily the payoff. And yeah, it's long hours, a lot of stress, as you can imagine. So yeah, it's not necessarily all that it's cracked up to be working for yourself. And again, it's not something I necessarily wanted to do. I kind of just ended up doing it anyhow. I'm not one of those proponents that say everyone should go out and work for themselves. If you want to, if you like to, fine. There's nothing wrong with it, obviously. But there's definitely downsides to it as well. I'm also not exactly a materialistic person. I'm probably the least materialistic person you'd ever meet, and the money is absolutely not a driver for me. Once I'm paying my bills or paying my mortgage, I'm not worried about things, right? It's like there's just, it's not going to buy happiness at all, like nothing. So yeah.
So tell me about how you've positioned yourself to service the SIs. So what does it look like? They go out and get a project and they just outsource the whole data make piece to you?
So one of the things I wanted to do when I started Gluon is not constantly be chasing sales, because I'm not a salesperson by nature. So I wanted to develop partnerships where I can get reoccurring business, from the same firms. And it's also a great way because you build friendships that way too. You're working with these people regularly, which is nice. So they generally feel like colleagues more than clients, for the most part. The other thing I like to do is I really do like training people. So So yeah, I struggled at the beginning finding the right employees. I recently partnered with a company down in Uruguay called VFG, and they've been absolutely great, right? So what's really nice is they have an office that they have people that can go to. Um, he's able to, he knows the local community and the local culture, right? So it's great, for hiring. People tend to think that, having an office to go to is not important. But I found that it really impacted my ability to hire, particularly offshore, right? So I partnered with this company, VFG. Right, they help me find people, they hire people, and they also have a deep bench, and I'm them able to train them up, oversee quality control, make sure everything's running as quality. I can do most of the client interaction myself, as needed, and it's been working out great. I'm super thrilled with how things are going. I think that was your question. I'm not even sure anymore. What was that?
No, I just wanted to understand how you are framing your offering. So is it
That's essentially it. I partner with an SI. They have a project that needs a data migration or an integration. They ask me, you got capacity for this, and I say, either yes or no. Generally, it's yes, and then we take that on. It's essentially that we act as an extension of their team.
So you do the discovery bit as well in the beginning, or do they do that and then just pass the user stories and requirements to you?
So no, we tend to be involved in the discovery as well. For the data bits, we're not necessarily doing hardcore business discovery, right? Again, our goal is to stay out of their space, right? Let them do what they do well, themselves, and then we come in there and help. So for example, for data migration, depending on the client, some client really wants to do the mapping themselves and handle that. Or we can do the mapping, but we're still going to need the assistance of the Salesforce VA or consultant because they own the Salesforce build. We'll do the data analysis of the source system, right? Because again, they generally won't have the skills for that. And then we go back and forth with our questions, just like you said, no different if you were working with an internal data migration specialist, right? It's just no different than having that role internally. We act as an extension of their team.
So let's say hypothetically you've got this, actually not hypothetical because I did have this client who needed to, so there's a few different things. One was they needed to move off their retail platform that was creaking and the license was expiring. And a whole host of other things that they needed integrating and migrating as well. The challenge was one of their legacy systems, the vendor had gone bankrupt. They kept it going through goodwill and lots of prayers, and the administrator left. So from a partner point of view, that was a huge risk. Because they kind of required some reverse engineering to try and figure out the data model and things like that. So in terms, if that was the scenario, you would be the partner who'd come in and have a look at that legacy system. Am I right to look at how?
Yes. So here's at a high level the process, or how I would approach your exact scenario. Step one, I want a system demo, user interface based, right? We'll go through the whole thing and we'll take notes on, okay, this is what's being done, this is what the system does, this is what's being captured, the data that's being captured, at least at an object level. Understand the one-to-one relationships to one-to-many relationships. And then we get access to the back end, however that is, if it's an API, if it's a SQL backup, if it's an Oracle system, whatever it is. We get access to the data, and we devise a plan to extract the data, all the data. Okay. Again, if it's a SQL backup, that might just be I take a backup and I restore. If it's an APIs, maybe I got to write code that extracts all the data and loads it into a local system repository. That repository serves two purposes. One, it's going to be a source for our migration. And again, that extraction code is automated, right? So I can always extract it again later. It's going to be the source system for migration. And once you shut down the live system, that's a backup in case they need that data later for whatever reason. Maybe it's patched to migration because the defect was found later. Maybe it's, they decide that they didn't migrate something that they need also. Maybe it's they need evidence for a dispute. I don't know, right? So it could be for whatever. So you have that. Then what we do is we do data analysis. So I now know what data I'm looking for. We then go and we find that in the data repository. And we usually do that by querying the metadata, right? And for the most part, it's not that difficult if you know what you're doing. There are occasions where some systems just have like generic names, custom field 1, custom field 2, custom field 3, custom field text 1, custom field text 2. And usually when that's the case, what you do is they'll have the metadata somewhere that's driving how that's displayed on the screen. So it's really cracking that code. So we'll spend the time to understand the legacy schema, and if needed, the metadata that's driving that, if it's a system that allows for heavy customizations, right? And then we assemble a mapping doc from there, and then we'll move from there. We often validate the mapping doc by the UI, right? So I'm saying, okay, this is what I believe is the address field. This is what I believe is the ID. This is what I believe is the name. I'll go into the UI, you search for it, and then you can literally validate the data matches, the data matches, the data matches. We've had an instance like sometimes you just can't find a piece of data. We've literally written code that searches the entire database, every single field for a particular string, and then you'll find it, right? So again, the things, if you come from a strong data background, they don't sound so outrageous. But when you're coming from the Salesforce world, these are not skills that you find within the Salesforce world. And again, this is one of the reasons we started Gluon, is to really bring these kind of skills to the table. Anyhow, at that point, our data migration is wholly automated, right? We have the source data, we have a transformation layer that transforms it to the Salesforce object model, and then we have data that, again, code that loads it. No data loaders, no manual steps, and it just literally kind of push button from there, from the extraction, transformation to the load. Then we do our validation with the client, and then if the client finds defects, we don't fix the data, we fix the code that's transforming the data and loading it, and then we can rerun it. And that's how we know that when we're ready to go live, this thing is going to be spot on, right? Because there's no human processes that can, slip a finger or make a mistake. One thing that computers do better than people is be consistent, and that's essentially what we're relying on. And I think that's really where a lot of manual data migrations fail. Is one, there's the inconsistency in the human process, right? So what happens is you have a this happens all the time, right? I have a data migration project. I assign a Salesforce BA, hey, load this data in, and like, here's an Excel sheet of their accounts, here's an Excel sheet of their contact, here's an Excel sheet of their opportunities. They look at it, yeah, no problem, right? Spend a couple hours, they bang it in. Right, they're ready to go live, they do the same thing, they validate it, right? Then they go ahead, they do it again. They do that again, the next project, right? Maybe they have activities this time also, no problem, they go, they bang it in. This person then becomes like, hey, he knows how to do data migration, it's wonderful. Maybe he writes a blog article, about it, and then they're put on a $2 million project where they have to migrate 30 objects. They're giving databases, they're not giving CSVs. They're dealing with millions of records that no computer, no laptop is going to deal with. Excel is going to crash. They can't do VLOOKUPs, and they end up with like a document like this long, 8-9 pages long of do this transformation, do that transformation, do this transformation, right? Load this file, get the success files, merge the success files, right? And it's literally that long. They finish the process. To do the data migration takes 3 days. So there's no going live on a weekend, right? They tell the client you need to be offline for 2.5 weeks. They get a defect. They're not going to spend 4 days running the whole thing. So they just patch the data. Then they update their notes. And then they've never done a full end-to-end process, right? And then they wonder why the thing is failing. And then the person who's supposed to do this go live quits because they're terrified of it. So they find a new job before they have to go live, and then somebody has to inherit this, right? Yeah, it's an absolute mess of a process, but it happens all the time. It's all the time. You hear the story over and over and over again. And that's really like, right, those are the pain points you want to address. And it's not this BA's fault, right? I'm not blaming this BA in any way. They were not trained to work with data, and they should not have been assigned it to begin with. The problem is that they had a couple of easy tools and a couple of easy migrations that gave them confidence, and then now it's like, it's a completely different ballgame. So yeah.
Absolutely. I think the process that you described is just magic, absolute magic, and not enough partners and companies and projects view data migration in that way. It's basically a patch job, like, let's look at this thing and how do we do this, just migrate this thing, how about everything else, all the interconnected bits are just not thought about. So thank you for sharing that. That's really, really useful, and kind of wish that it was more. So you said earlier on that you enjoy training. Is training one of your offerings? So if, let's say, a partner in the UK is listening to this and think, oh, you know what, we just need to level up our data migration capabilities, is training something that you provide?
It is. It's not a core offering, because it requires so much of my personal time. But I have absolutely done this, like I said, multiple times in the past. And then it depends on the team that you're shoring up. The other part of it is this takes close to a year to train someone to be good at data migrations, and it depends on their varying levels of skill. So for someone who has decent data skills, meaning they come from a data background, they know how to work with databases, and they know how to work with SQL. Then you got to teach them how to deal with Salesforce APIs, and they got to learn the Salesforce object model and all of that kind of stuff, right? And then, to have someone who knows them both, Salesforce and SQL, they tend to not really need training much, but you don't find those people too often. Very few and far between. So it's either usually taking a Salesforce training and then you got to train them on core databases and SQL, and that takes a while, or you're getting them with solid SQL skills and you got to train them on Salesforce, and then both of those people need to be trained on data migration best practices and the patterns. Again, it's all outlined in my book, so you can always self-train.
Fantastic. So it sounds like you're providing a very niche, kind of, the cross-section of all the skills that's required to do this properly, especially on complex projects. So thank you for sharing that, Dave. Very mindful of your time. One fun questions before we wrap up. You said earlier on that you couldn't find the book because you've just given it to your son. How old is your son, and what's he doing with your college book?
So it's interesting. So he's currently, he just finished high school. He's 19. He's going to be 19 actually next week. So he took a gap year, spent it in Israel, and then he'll start Brooklyn College next year on a full scholarship honors. So real proud of him. I don't know if he wants to go into technology. I was starting my company and he wanted to get some part-time work. So I said, learn databases, then I'll give you a job, basically, something along those lines. But it was before he went off to school, but it's still in his room, is all it is. It's one of the nice things about SQL. It really hasn't changed that much in 20 years, nor has relational databases, at least the fundamentals hasn't.
Thank you so much, Dave, for that. I really appreciate you taking the time to record this for me. It has been really fun because, as I mentioned, I am also a data nerd, and to hear your journey, your story, especially how you're using your skills and your experience to tackle a very important gap. So I've seen a lot of data migration issues, problems, and I did have one question. So before we go, you're talking about how data migration, might take a while. So both our backgrounds coming from Microsoft, where the server is on premise, databases, migration doesn't take as long as it does now, where everything's on the cloud, and there's it's slow, really. Thoughts?
Salesforce, again, I have a whole chapter on performance tuning. Salesforce is really good with loading massive volumes of data. The issues that you face are the custom code, which are essentially database triggers, right? That kick off as you update records. So if you were to load, let's say you were to load a flat object that has no lookups, no rollups, no formulas, nothing on it, you can load millions upon millions of records in an hour, for sure, using the bulk data loader and not get a single error, right? The issue is the locking and then the database triggers that kick on. And there's various ways to approach that. I talk about how to avoid locking errors pretty extensively, because that's essentially the biggest thing. So performance tuning in really, really, really super summary. Avoid locking. They discuss a couple of that in the book and in my blog. Second key, don't push updates you don't need. That's obvious, right? In terms of performance gains. And then thirdly, if you have automations that are slowing things down, you want to know if you can turn them off. Sometimes you can't. The common advice online is, just turn everything off. That's not necessarily true, because you might need whatever that automation does. So you have to understand the automation, and then two, if you do understand the automation, you might be able to turn it off and then update whatever that automation was doing in your ETL code. So for examples, rollups is a great example. Rollups are going to be slow in Salesforce. So for example, if I'm pushing in, hundreds of records or hundreds of thousands of records, let's say, and each one is triggering a rollup, that can be very slow. But if I push all the updates, turn off the rollup, let's say, right? Now I know you can't necessarily turn off rollups, but you turn off the rollup and then you have the ETL calculate the rollups and then update those records once, right? So there are ways to go around that. I mean, in this case, again, you can't necessarily turn off Salesforce rollups, but you're talking about a code-based rollup or like a rollup helper type thing. So again, it's the issue is not going over the internet. That's just internet latency. The issue is primarily database trigger type logic, right? Workflows, process builders, that kind of stuff. And then locking is the big thing. Salesforce does a lot of this stuff beneath the hood, even when you have no code. So for example, updating a record with a master detail is going to be slower than updating a record with a lookup, right? And it's again because there is trigger code that you just don't know about.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And I also like the fact that you've written a book. So anytime someone asks you a question, it's in chapter 3. That's in chapter 9. So, but thank you for taking the time to even summarize a lot of that. I totally relate, and I have enjoyed this conversation very much. Once again, I thank you for your time, Dave. And perhaps at one point there might be a part two. There are things that I want to talk about a bit more, but let's leave it for now. I really appreciate your time.
Hey, look, if you want to do a follow-up, I'll be more than happy to. We should figure out how to get you an autographed copy.
Oh, that would be amazing. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.